In April of 1942, 78,000 American and Filipino soldiers surrendered on the Bataan Peninsula. In the days that followed, tens of thousands of those men would vanish along a 65-mile march toward a prisoner camp. The Bataan Death March is often remembered as an act of spontaneous brutality, but the suffering on that road was the inevitable result of cascading strategic miscalculations that doomed these men long before they ever laid down their weapons. To understand why, we have to look at the Western Pacific in 1941. The Philippines sat squarely along the shipping lanes Japan needed to fuel its expansion. For the United States, the islands were a vital foothold used to project power across the region. Japan struck immediately after Pearl Harbor to remove that threat. Ground forces landed on the island of Luzon and pushed inland so rapidly that Allied leaders were forced to abandon their defensive plans within a matter of days. But while the Japanese invasion was the catalyst for the defeat, it was an American strategic blunder in the months prior that sealed the fate of the 78,000 troops. Years before the war, the U.S. military developed a strategy called War Plan Orange 3. This called for a deliberate retreat to the defensible Bataan Peninsula, where massive stockpiles of food and medicine were supposed to be pre-positioned to support a long-term siege. However, when General Douglas MacArthur took command in 1941, he discarded that plan. He favored a strategy that attempted to defend the entire coastline, ordering his forces to challenge the Japanese directly on the beaches. That decision proved catastrophic. When the invasion began, the coastal defenses failed, forcing a panicked, disorganized retreat to Bataan. Because the withdrawal happened so quickly, the massive stockpiles of food and medicine required for the peninsula's defense were abandoned elsewhere on the island. For 3 months, the defenders held the peninsula, while starvation and disease hollowed out their ranks. Men lived on a quarter of their normal rations, as malaria and dysentery spread through overcrowded camps, leaving medical personnel with almost no medicine to treat the infections. By the time Major General Edward P. King surrendered on April 9, 1942, the 78,000 men under his command were already a dying force, physically incapacitated before the march even began. The surrender created a logistical crisis. The Japanese 14th Army had not anticipated such a massive group of prisoners and had virtually no preparations in place to transport 78,000 men away from the battlefield. Violence began instantly. Guards stripped the captives of their remaining captives and valuables. If a soldier was found carrying Japanese currency or battlefield souvenirs, the guards often executed them on the spot, suspecting them of looting dead Japanese soldiers. The prisoners were then ordered to begin a 65-mile trek to Camp O'Donnell. For men who had spent months fighting on reduced rations while battling tropical disease, the distance was a physical impossibility. The Japanese guards actively exploited the environment. Prisoners were subjected to the sun treatment, forced to sit motionless with bare heads under the intense heat for hours at a time. Often within sight of fresh drinking water, they were forbidden to touch. There was a zero-tolerance policy for weakness. Anyone who stumbled or fell was beaten, bayoneted, or shot where they lay. If a Filipino civilian tried to offer food or water to the passing columns, the guards often executed both the civilian and the prisoner. The march functioned as a rolling execution. It systematically stripped away the prisoners' endurance, using their deteriorated physical state as a justification for their murder. At the town of San Fernando, the survivors reached the next stage of the journey, the rail network. Here, the torment shifted from physical exhaustion to claustrophobic suffocation. This schematic shows the lethal reality of the transport. The prisoners were packed into metal boxcars built to hold 40 men at most. The guards forced more than 100 into each car before sliding the doors shut. Inside, there was no ventilation and no room to sit. The tropical heat built rapidly, and men began dying of heat stroke and suffocation while standing upright because there was no space for their bodies to fall. The survivors were eventually let out for a final 9-mile march to Camp O'Donnell, but the facility offered no relief. It lacked the clean water and medical supplies necessary to stop the death toll from rising by hundreds each day. Out of the 78,000 who surrendered, only 54,000 men survived to reach the camp. The rest were left on the road or in the boxcars along the way. In the United States, the scale of the atrocity remained hidden for nearly 2 years. With the battle lost and the islands occupied, the American public was kept in the dark about the fate of the Bataan defenders. That changed in January of 1944. A group of American officers who had escaped captivity and reached Allied lines provided sworn testimonies. Their accounts of the march were soon published in Life magazine, bringing the details of the executions and starvation to the wider public. This exposure of Japanese cruelty fueled a wave of public anger. These reports turned the abstract news of a distant defeat into a documented demand for retribution. The revelations solidified the American public's commitment to the conflict. The accounts of the march strengthened support for the war effort, ensuring that the return to the Philippines was seen as a necessary mission of justice for the men of Bataan. In late 1944, American forces returned to the Philippines in a massive amphibious assault. By early 1945, Allied troops had recaptured Bataan and liberated Manila, finally reclaiming the ground where the march had begun. Following the Japanese surrender, Allied authorities arrested General Masaharu Homma. He was charged with war crimes specifically related to the abuse of prisoners during the march and the subsequent neglect in the camps. Homma was found guilty and executed in 1946. However, official recognition from Japan arrived much later. It took until 2010 for a formal apology to be issued to the surviving American prisoners. The Bataan Death March serves as a record of what happens when a collapsed military strategy meets a complete lack of humanitarian preparation. In the end, the cost of that failure was borne by the 54,000 men who reached the camp, and the thousands who did not.